So, dear colleagues, now to the boring stuff, I'm tempted to say. No, but I'm kidding, but I have to make a boring announcement. It's not a good start for a presentation, but just to moderate your expectations, as some of you put pressure on me yesterday by saying, tomorrow you're going to present how the post-growth future looks like, and all will be bright. That's definitely not the case. Actually, I will not talk about how the economic geographies of a post-growth future will look like. I can't do that. I won't do that. I rather talk about the future of economic geography when it is to tackle post-growth issues and ideas and possible post-growth futures. That's more my trajectory. So I'm looking into the future of a discipline, and don't be afraid, it won't be go into the very details of our very discipline or sub-discipline. I think many of the things I addressed today will apply to at least other social sciences, if not science at large, when it comes to concepts and methodologies. The second disclaimer I have to make, this is very much work in progress, but I thought this is a nice arena for just throwing some preliminary ideas and exchange them with you. And then finally, a third disclaimer. I initially didn't want to show this picture because it's kind of outdated, not only in fashion terms, but when I saw Johannes yesterday morning for the first time arriving at the hotel in his Patagonia jacket, I couldn't help myself but recycling this picture, which I used in the past, to indicate that apparently, apart from those magnet fishers and other small initiatives, there's probably something going on in the more mainstream economy when it comes to thinking about resources more carefully, thinking about long-term solutions to resource depletion and the like. One could suspect Patagonia, and I'm not advertising Patagonia here, but one could suspect them to be clever in this advertising campaign by trying to prevent us from buying their products, by that raising awareness of their products. But I think they have proven over the past 2 decades or so that they're very serious about repair concepts, recycling concepts, and maintenance they offer to their clients. And they have been a role model not only for other firms in this outdoor clothing sector, but also for many other firms. Think of what we see today, do-it-yourself or second-hand sections in garment stores, in tool shops or the like, just to give you some examples. What I plan to do over the next 25 minutes or so is just quickly repeat the essence of growth criticism. We talked about that largely yesterday. Just quickly from my perspective, I will then clarify some uncertainties around the notions of post-growth and degrowth in terms of terminology, but also concepts behind. Before I come to the 2 major points of my presentation, the one will be, how does our discipline, standing for other disciplines, takes post-growth thinking up in their ongoing research in conceptualizations, and what are the challenges related to that. That will be the first main section, and the second will be to at least give you some hope to address 2 avenues I find promising, 2 rather recent concepts I find promising that could help us building up new frameworks for our own research on post-growth futures. And time permitting, there will be short discussion in the end. So just quickly, what I could hear from the comments yesterday and today, you're all aware of this, the general criticism of the mechanisms of capitalism. We talked about that extensively, the failure of the trickling down promise. In more technical terms, this fixation on GDP being the sole and most important indicator debated in policy realms, in media realms and elsewhere. Definitely an issue criticized since the GDP exists. And from a resource point of view, what Nico Pech called the decoupling myth, the myth or the promise that with growing efficiency in the production sector, for example, or in the consumption, a decoupling between economic growth on the one hand and resource or material consumption on the other could happen. This belief or this promise has proven to be wrong, as this picture may illustrate. If you look at the 2 upper lines of that graph, you see in orange the GDP growth, globally speaking, since 1970. And you see in the gray line, the second line, the material consumption related to that. And you see the direct coupling of those 2 lines. And at best, you see in the early 1990s, kind of a relative decoupling, where the gap between the 2 lines gets a bit broader, which is mainly due to windfall profits after the closure of big industrial manufacturing firms in Eastern European countries and the former Soviet Union. So we rather have a parallel kind of development of those lines, and some authors even talk about a recoupling, meaning that the decoupling idea it's done somehow as the empirical evidence shows. Be skeptical when you see this kind of pictures for single countries or single regions or single products, but they rarely apply a comprehensive lifetime assessment of a product. So the same figure for the UK, for example, would probably show you a widening gap, maybe even not only relative decoupling, but an absolute decoupling, maybe resource consumption going down in relation to what's produced in the UK. But if you include what has been outsourced to other world regions, and if you include that, like the authors of this statistics did when looking at trade statistics, how much resources are traded between countries. It's not the actual consumption, it's the trade between countries as a proxy for the actual consumption. This picture is far more telling than any more regional analysis. Maybe I have to be precise on what post-growth is not about, as it is often misunderstood by policymakers, by journalists in particular. They simply think post-growth, it's the opposite of growth. It's something declining, something shrinking, it's a recession, something negatively connotated, definitely. That's definitely not what post-growth scholars or degrowth scholars / activists mean by using this term. It's rather an attempt to overcome those inherent mechanisms of capitalism that lead us to the belief in continuous growth, starting with the credit system, overtax incentives, the general idea of how value is created, and all the inequalities resulting from that. Post-growth definitely goes beyond the notion of resources. Maybe the figure I showed is a bit misleading in this regard. It goes beyond that and asks far more fundamental and emancipatory questions. To what extent does capitalism systematically disadvantage certain communities, be it ethnic communities, be it women on the labor market, be it those taking care of children or elderly people? We talked about care work in the preceding discussion. And it's, as Mariana Mazzucato put it, it's probably more the search for a purpose-oriented economy that serves the common good to be understood as the social part of it, but also the underlying ecological, if you like, foundations of our existence. The reason why the decoupling, the aspired decoupling, didn't work can be found, amongst others, in what since a long time is known as the rebound effect, that every technological innovation, other than using less resources in the future, has led to more consumption of resources, either in the same sector or elsewhere, known as the Jevons paradox, the rebound effect. And Jevons, who studied this effect when the steam engines were invented and railway was invented, and the belief was that with those more performant energy production tools, the overall consumption of energy would be reduced. The opposite was the case. The coal consumption skyrocketed during industrialization because those technologies then led to other innovations and other modes of production that were very much resource consuming. The rebound effect can happen in very mundane areas. You insulate your home, and with the money you gain from that, you maybe do something which is resource consuming, an additional holiday flight, a new smartphone, or the like. So this kind of consumer rebound effects also exists. That's a starting point for post-growth thinking and critique by saying, despite 30 to 40 years of eco-modernization, 30 to 40 years investment into eco-efficiency in many regards, be it in the energy sector, be it in the producer sector, we haven't reached any particular decoupling. And in this efficiency approach, or the next iteration of that would have been the consistency approach, those closed loops and circular economy, for example, we essentially talked about the how question. How do we produce to be more efficient, to use less resources, to become sustainable in the long run, socially and environmentally speaking? The post-growth thinking introduces the notion of sufficiency. I'll come up with another disclaimer in a second about the notion of sufficiency, and ask questions that are far more about the what and the why. What do we produce? What kind of products do we need? Do we need ever-growing cars and the next generation of SUVs? So that's one notion of sufficiency. And why do we produce rockets flying to Mars or the like? It's admittedly very normative questions. I come back to the notion of normativity later in my talk. What I want to disclaim here is that the notion of sufficiency is a very tricky one, because it's often misunderstood, maybe deliberately misunderstood by policymakers, and equaled with self-restriction, with very sober, very modest lifestyles, no fun, back to medieval times in terms of consumption patterns. All those metaphors associated with sufficiency or sobriety are probably misleading. And the sufficiency idea here, as my examples will show, definitely goes beyond the individual consumption patterns and lifestyles and critically thinking about what we need as individuals. It's more the systemic question of what we need as a society, what kind of future we aspire for when it comes to resource or sustainability questions at large. Finally, in this introduction, I wanted to avoid confusion around the two terms, post-growth and degrowth, which are by many authors used interchangeably, as I did until now in this presentation. And we are far from having kind of a consensus around those terms, in particular as they don't work in all languages. For example, in German language, the post-growth notion is far more dominant than degrowth, which is difficult to translate into German language, while degrowth and décroissance in the French word actually comes from, are well established, far more established than the notion of post-growth. Timothée Paric, one of the leading voices of degrowth scholarship, French economists, in his book published 3 or 4 weeks ago, I think, he makes an interesting definition, which I will use for the purpose of this presentation. Again, there's no consensus around that. He says degrowth is the process, the trajectory, the pathway to some post-growth future. And he essentially focuses on ways to reduce material consumption, for example, to redistribute within a society to overcome inequalities, but also globally speaking between the North and the South, or the more well-off and the more deprived world regions. That's actually where décroissance, the French school of décroissance thinking, comes from. It comes from North-South debates in the 1970s, 1980s already. And it's about reorganizing the production system, our everyday life, including mobility issues and the like. While post-growth, according to Paric, is more what we imagine to be a maybe utopian future, a kind of steady state future, even though the term steady state can be contested in physical or economic terms. But it's maybe a nice attribute to describe what this could be about. Something which overcomes all those negative externalities of the current prevailing economic system. So now to what economic geographers and cognate disciplines do about that. I think there's a quite a dynamic uptake of post-growth ideas in literature over the last 5 to 10 years, maybe in our discipline. And we are probably very good in studying sectoral examples of now-topias or really existing utopias, as we heard earlier, in the fields of food and agriculture, for example. Jose will talk about that after the lunch break, in the energy sector, in the realm of do-it-yourself makerspaces, fab labs, or the repair movement, and the like. When it comes to housing, new forms of collective housing, collective ownership, and the like, finance, an emerging issue here, and labor or labor relations at large. There we have a lot of empirical work and a proliferating kind of literature, in particular when it comes to the level of ongoing PhD projects. We have an increasing number of urban research scholars, urban geographers, planners, architects, urban sociologists, looking into the consequences or in the articulations, I should say, the articulations of post-growth practices in the urban context. Think of co-working spaces, think of new types of architecture that combine in pandemic times and home office times, that combine family life with the workplace in a much better way than in the past, just to give you a few examples. And there's a limited but slowly growing number of more conceptual contributions to what this is about and how, as a discipline, with our concepts, our models, our terminology, we should react to those post-growth ideas out there. Again, I'm not standing here to advocate post-growth or to sell the idea or to be missionary in any regard. It's an observation that it's taking traction, it's becoming more important, and there's a lot to understand and to study for us, not only us economic geographers. What I'd like to discuss in this talk today is three particular challenges I see at the conceptual level as to our theoretical building of new models or adapting old models, the terminology we use and its performativity. Don't want to anticipate what Martin is going to talk about tomorrow, but probably there's some interfaces with your talk, but also some very practical methodological implications of that. Starting with the conceptual challenges, most of the mainstream, I know that's a slippery term, mainstream, probably there's different definitions of that within one discipline, but what I would consider being the mainstream for our discipline, given all its plurality and diversity, meaning those models you find in almost all textbooks in our discipline. Most of those mainstream models, they consciously or unconsciously somehow remain anchored in a growth logic, in a trickling down logic, things we criticized largely in this conference. In the paper, I will give two illustrative examples of that. I don't have the time here, and it's maybe too detailed for this very audience to rather established concepts debated in economic geography since quite some time. And I will then show to what extent they use a more or less growth-fixated vocabulary and understandings of the economy. But it's also about how our discipline and others are to develop new models, probably better fitting, more appropriate to post-growth logics and thinking. And maybe one strand of literature, just to mention one, around the notion of diverse economies in our disciplines at least, has been quite influential over the past years and bears some potential for further exploration, as today it's rather a weak theory or rather heuristic framework one can use and certainly further develop. More immediately and maybe more urgently is my invitation to think critically about our everyday terminology, maybe to start with innovation as Johannes referred to it a few minutes ago. The prevailing understanding of innovation, correct me if I'm wrong, in our discipline is rather technology-oriented or production process, production organization-oriented. It's more about the technicalities and the feasibility of reaching higher efficiency, for example, speaking about sustainability issues. It is to a much lesser extent, with very few exceptions, about social innovations, about learning between communities that are not part of what we usually call the economy, cross-sectoral fertilization between the civil society sector, for example, and the corporate sector, or the like. So other types of innovations. And as I think it was Richard, in response to Johannes a few moments ago, the notion of exnovation. So is there areas, technologies, where it might make sense to go several steps back, forgetting about innovations, and go to something that worked much better in the past. Industrial agriculture might be a good example for an idea of where innovation could be appropriate. I don't go into all the terms listed here, and definitely this list is not exhaustive or comprehensive. It's just to indicate that behind every of those terms we use to apply in our everyday work as empirical scholars in economic geography, and maybe that applies to other disciplines, we very often forget about where these terms come from. There's, of course, a broad debate about the notion of development, but maybe less amongst the economic geographers looking at regional development processes. There's development geographers looking at north-south inequalities and the like, of course, but the conceptual underpinnings when studying the economic success of a certain industry in a given region is very often coming without any critical reflection about the notion of development. And this is not the least mirrored by the indicators, the data we use, GDP, jobs created, patents submitted, all those standard indicators used in our disciplines. Which brings me to labor as another dimension of post-growth, which is more and more debated in the literature, that any post-growth regime will also come with a different understanding of what we call labor, and that the distinction between paid labor here, statistically monitored, politically recognized, and unpaid labor like care work, volunteering, or other activities that are constitutional for the functioning of our society, being rather overlooked in any economic development debate so far. I get back to this notion of what the economy is about. And thirdly, methodological challenges. Again, not an exhaustive list, just some thoughts. We talked about indicators already, the misleading GDP and the like. Doing research on post-growth, be it in the realm of agriculture or sharing schemes or whatsoever, requires probably new skills amongst the researchers, those who do the inquiry. And I'm happy to hear what, in particular, Felix, as an anthropologist, thinks about my pledge for more immersive and ethnographic research when it comes to new practices we want to explore. To put it bluntly, an economic geographer used to conduct interviews with CEOs or bankers, wearing a suit, a tie, speaking of my male colleagues, will have difficulties to immerse into a local community with magnet fishing or other interesting initiatives, and to come with the credibility the researcher needs to even access that community. It's a matter of attitude, it's a matter of methods, it's a matter of time, which brings me to this more general question of whether we stick to more extractive research methods or whether we aim for more participatory, more immersive, more long-term methods. And this often comes with the question, are we action researchers or not? Do we declare ourselves action researchers or not because we normatively aim for some betterment, or some of the degrowth scholars at least pretend doing that, which raises far more fundamental question about our self-understanding as scientists and our positionality in those processes. I refer back to this in the conclusions. Before that, shortly, two concepts that emerged over the last couple of years and I found intriguing, not only for our discipline to be further explored, not in the sense of providing us a recipe how to study post-growth or how to incorporate post-growth ideas into our thinking, but at least frameworks that need to be, from the viewpoint of our discipline, need to be urgently spatialized in the sense of what does that mean, not only for one single sector or one single firm, but for a region, a city, a national economy, for example. And to what extent do those ideas challenge our hitherto understanding and our current concepts and theories? It's the foundational economy I want to introduce shortly, and then the idea of the economy for the common good, or a particular articulation of that idea. The foundational economy's idea not surprisingly, comes from a collective of authors, most of them based in the UK and some in the Netherlands. So probably the most, if I may, Martin, the most neoliberal economies in Western Europe, which have seen a strong degree of privatization of activities formerly provided by the welfare state. And maybe in reaction to that, in reaction to all the negative implications of that privatization process over the last 30 to 40 years, this collective claims for a reorientation of any economic development policy, which should focus on those activities that are essential to our everyday life. The very mundane services and goods all of us need, utilities, including infrastructure, health provision, healthcare provision, education, transportation, mobility, and food processing and retailing, to name the most important one. The idea of the foundational economy is not to invert the privatization process of many of those activities and re-collectivize them or re-socialize them. That's not the idea. Nor is it the idea to offer those services and goods for free. Like there's this idea, an analogy to the unconditional basic income we heard about yesterday. There's also a claim for an unconditional basic infrastructure, saying all those basic services should be offered for free. That's not necessarily the intention of the foundational economies scholarship. It's more about rethinking the relationship the public, and by that the policymakers or the governments have with the private sector. And it's not meant to be a claim for further public-private partnership or this kind of weird constructions. It's more about how does local, regional, or national governments regain control over the what and why question I raised earlier in terms of sufficiency or post-growth orientation. So how can a municipality make sure that the energy provider, to pick one utility, the local energy provider, acts in a way that first there is a security, energy security for the local population, that no societal group is systematically disadvantaged, that the benefits of that company are not driven to the extreme and then probably allocated elsewhere. And one tool they propose is to work with so-called social licenses of operation. It's not a new term, but it's maybe reframed in this particular context. We're saying, for example, for this utility, electricity provider for municipality, the municipality would make a call and then would give the social license to operate to the company that comes with the most plausible and most convincing concept about where to reinvest benefits, how to control the price level, what kind of resources to be used, renewables, for example, for the energy production or the like. So in a far more democratic process to decide upon the options one has when giving this kind of license to a then private or collective, could be a cooperative as well, operator. In the interest of time, I skip to the second example, but I'm happy to take your questions on those two approaches afterwards. Economy for the common good, very much related to the name of the Austrian writer, activist, dancer, Christian Felber. And it's not that I pray his idea here, but his book has been influential, first published in German, I think in 2016, and the English edition available since last year, who comes up with, and he was the starting point of a now international network of local and regional common good initiatives, as they call themselves. And they developed an interesting tool, I think, for operationalizing what this kind of vague notion of the common good actually means. For different types of stakeholders, you see in the left column of this table, supply firms, the companies themselves, the people working in companies, the civic stakeholders living around a company, and so on. They look into 4 dimensions human dignity, social justice, I keep it brief, environmental sustainability, and then the notion of transparency, democracy, corporate democracy, if you like. A table which can be applied to single firms, which can be applied to public institutions, municipalities, for example, which has been applied to educational institutions, university, for example. And most recently, I saw a master thesis where somebody applied this table or this matrix to a local economic development authority and their policies when it comes to the support of the local industry. So just briefly, logic behind for each of those boxes you see here. There is a detailed explanation of what this is about. I picked one example of the co-determination. To what extent do the employers have a say on what the company does? And here there's predefined levels of, if you like, achievement, which are then, I keep it short, are then rated. And I'm well aware of all the flaws coming with this kind of numeric and metric rating, and then result in kind of a balance sheet showing where a company, for example, stands in its evolution. It's not about certifying whether a company is common good orientated or not. It's more about helping them to evolve towards something more. To me, acknowledging all the methodological implications coming with that, to me, it's far more diligent, far more systematic than many other labels we know in the realm of environmental certification or the like, which we've seen in the past. Just quickly, if I may, 3 points I wanted to discuss with you and just briefly. We heard about upscaling earlier. Just one comment onto this. It's a broad debate, a very important debate in the postgrowth scholarship community to think about how those often romanticized smaller initiatives can be upscaled. The local community-based agriculture project, for example, and the like. I think that the notion of upscaling in its quantitative sense, making it bigger, making it more mainstream, comes with some pitfalls, or at least can be misleading. And we have examples for unsuccessful upgrading in the past. If you think of locally created car sharing schemes of the 1990s, who then became commercialized and now run by the big car manufacturing companies, just to give you one example of upscaling not necessarily being a good choice in this regard. Upscaling can be thought horizontally by replication, but more importantly, I think it's what we heard earlier, how can one learn from those initiatives and how can they become influential for other sectors or other activities? It's about how we frame the topic. I referred to the slippery term sufficiency earlier. So how in our research with our terminology we give those terms the right framing that doesn't lead to misunderstandings. And finally, a question we might want to debate here about our self-understanding. What does activist research mean? How do we handle with those admittedly normative concepts like the common good economy? I keep it there in the interest of time. Thank you.